Do you like to play with alternate win conditions? Watch your opponent get frustrated. Not let your opponent have any fun, but can't afford lantern control. Well, then you're probably interested in mill. Basically, there's a rule in Magic the Gathering where if an opponent is required to draw a card but there's no cards left in the library, they automatically lose the game. A mill deck seeks to force your opponent to discard cards from your library into your graveyard until they have no more cards to draw, allowing you to win the game in the most roundabout and frustrating way possible. Now, if you're planning on building a mill deck, you're probably going to be looking at a number of different cards. Some of them are going to be amazing, some of them are going to be terrible. In this video, I plan on reviewing several of these cards, letting you know what I think of them and why I think that, and then afterwards I'll present another video on a basic deck tech for a mill deck. Now remember, mill isn't terribly competitive against tier 1 decks, although it can hold its own against some of them. And of course, a lot of people are going to disagree with my assessment of the cards. Feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below with your thoughts and ideas. Jace, Memory Adept, is 3 of anything and 2 blue to get a Planeswalker. Now, his +1 and his -7 are really irrelevant to what we're doing, but his 0 ability is really key. Basically, it allows you to mill 10 cards from your opponent's library every activation, so that means you're basically doing a Glimpse the Unthinkable every turn. Now, this gives you huge value, and it makes Jace a huge target. Your opponent has to deal with him, otherwise they're going to be dead in a few turns. My only problem with Jace Memory Adept is that he costs 5 mana. This means that even in the best case scenario, you're only going to get him out on turn 5. And at this time in the game, you should be almost ready to mill your opponent out. If it's turn 5 and your opponent still has like 40 cards in their library, you're probably going to lose the game unless they're just developing an extremely slow board state. Still, this might be a 1 of or a 2 of in a deck depending on how you feel about it, so overall I'd give this a C. Hedron Crab is 1 blue for a 0/2 crab creature that has landfall. Now, the best thing about this is that whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, your opponent has to mill 3 cards from their library. Normally, this creature has tremendous value in a mill deck and is almost a must include. He basically mills 3 cards every time you play a land and can serve as a chump blocker early or sometimes even late game. It's important to know that Hedron Crab works best when you have a ton of fetch lands in your library. Now, the fetch lands are a good idea because they help to thin your library, allows you to get your mana online quickly, and also draw regularly your mill cards instead of drawing things like lands when you don't need them. When combined with a Hedron Crab, however, you can double up and basically mill 6 every turn, and that's just tremendous value. I've had Hedron Crabs basically mill out my entire opponent in the whole match, and this little guy is definitely an A. Consuming Aberration costs 3 of anything, a blue and a black, for a star horror. Now, the cool thing about this is that its power and toughness is related to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyards. By the time you get this out, this thing is usually an enormous beater. The problem is that you usually can't get it out till at earliest turn 5, at which point you're either going to either win or lose the game. The other thing is it doesn't have anything like trample or flying or anything like that, so your opponent can easily just keep chump blocking this thing. I've played with it in my decks and I really like it, but overall it just doesn't seem that effective. Overall, I'd give this a D. A card I really do like, though, is Thing in the Ice. Thing in the Ice is 1 and a blue for a 0/4 defender that basically can chump block for you early game, and then later on can board wipe for you. Now, you have to cast 4 instants or sorceries to do this, but guess what? Your hand is filled with instants and sorceries, so getting this thing off is not really a problem. The good thing is he's good early game, and he's good late game, and he doesn't cost 2 mana to come out, and it's in your colors. So, overall, I'd give this an A. Manic Scribe costs 1 and a blue for a 0/3 human wizard that mills 4 when he enters the battlefield. This is a pretty cool enter the battlefield effect and gives you a good chump blocker, and at the beginning of each of your opponent's turns will mill 3 more cards from your opponent's library if you have Delirium enabled. Normally your deck is going to run 5 different card types. Those are sorcery, instants, lands, creatures, and artifacts. So getting Delirium online shouldn't be too hard depending on the cards that you're playing. Still, I think this guy's pretty good, but he's usually one of the first guys I take out when sideboarding. Overall, I'd give this card a B. Jace's Phantasm costs 1 blue for a 1/1 flyer that can get +4/+4 as long as there's 10 or more cards in your opponent's graveyard. Now, it's very easy to get 10 cards into your opponent's graveyard. And so a typical play is be turn 1, Jace's Phantasm, sometimes even turn 2, Jace's Phantasm, and then turn 3 or turn 2, Glimpse the Unthinkable. And then you've got 1 or 2 5/5 flyers that are on the battlefield and ready to attack by turn 2 or 3, which is a huge early game threat that's almost insurmountable. Overall, this card gets an A. White of Precinct 6 is 1 in a black for a 1/1 that gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your opponent's graveyard. Now this is very similar to Jace's Phantasm, but if you're playing a deck that doesn't run a lot of creatures, or you play a Crypt Incursion and take all of the creatures out of your opponent's library, or they have some sort of dredge or something like that, then White of Precinct 6 is going to be really ineffective in those cases. Overall, I'd rather play Jace's Phantasm, but still, this is a decent card. Overall, I'd give this a C. Sazdak, Lord of Secrets, is a legendary creature that costs 3 of anything, 2 blue, and 2 black. Basically, whenever he attacks, he can do damage to your opponent. He's got flying, which is great, but then he also mills cards according to how much combat damage he did to the player. A lot of people might like the look of Sazdak, but the problem is that he just costs too much. 7 mana means that at the earliest you're going to play him on turn 7, and by that time usually the game's already long decided. Overall, this is just unplayable in Modern Mill, so I'd give it an F. Now that covers the creatures, so let's go and talk about sorceries, instants, and artifacts. The first card I'd like to talk about is Glimpse the Unthinkable. This card is widely accepted as the best mill card available. It mills 10 cards for 2 mana, which is a 5 card for 1 mana ratio, and effectively mills 19% of our opponent's deck in one go. This card will serve as the foundation for all other comparisons in this video. Grade A. The next card we're going to look at is a card called Millstone, which is the namesake of this archetype. This card costs 2 to cast, and then another 2 and a tap each turn to put the top 2 cards of someone's library into the graveyard. Repeatedly activating this card for 5 turns would mill 10 cards, which means that you're going to spend 12 mana to mill 10 cards, so that gives you a 0.8 mana to card ratio. When you consider what you might be doing with those 2 mana from turn to turn, this card really isn't worth it. And the overall effect is it only mills 4% of your opponent's library, so on its own it would take 25 turns to mill your opponent out. Overall, I'd give this card a D. Archive Trap costs 3 and 2 blues to mill your opponent for 13. Now, that doesn't seem like great value, but one of the benefits is that there's a ton of searching that happens in Modern, and whenever your opponent searches their library for anything, you can activate Archive Trap for 0 mana. This means if they activate a fetch land or use any tutoring effect at all, you can cast Archive Trap for free and mill them for 13. This happens all the time in Modern, and a dream is for you to have 4 of these in your opening hand and your opponent cracks a fetch land and you just mill their entire library out. That rarely happens, but it's awesome when it does. Another trick is to drop a Ghost Quarter and destroy one of their non-basic lands, and then when they search for another land to replace it, then you hit them with the Archive Trap. And then afterwards, you can kind of play a game of chicken by destroying their land and seeing if they dare to replace it with a basic land. Overall, this card gets an A and is pretty much a must-play in any deck. Breaking and Entering is Glimpse the Unthinkable's younger brother. Instead of milling 10 for a blue and a black, it mills 8, which is still really, really good. One of the best things about it is that it's super cheap. It's like $1 compared to $40 for Glimpse the Unthinkable. So overall, its effect is almost the same, and it's way, way more affordable. Now, you're never really going to be able to cast Entering because the mana color just isn't in your color, unless you hide this card underneath a Shelldock Isle. If you do, you could cast this late game, which your opponent would never expect. Overall, I give this card an A-. Increasing Confusion allows you to pay X in a blue to have your opponent put the top X cards of his library into his graveyard. Now, it also has flashback, and when you flash it back, your opponent has to put twice as many as X into the graveyard. But the problem with this card is that the cost to mill ratio is just kind of low, and I think there are some better cards that could be played. Still, it's not terrible, and it might be a good card to include, depending if you like. Overall, a C. Mind Funeral is 1, a blue, and a black to have your target opponent reveal cards from the top of his library until he reveals 4 lands. That player then puts those cards in the graveyard. Now, the cool thing about Mind Funeral is that, well, it can potentially put a lot of cards into your opponent's graveyard, but the bad side is that it could also put very few. It's kind of a toss-up. I usually like to try and play this as late as possible because it allows me to kind of get more lands through other methods and then kind of mill them out towards the end. but that's just my own way of playing, and I don't really have any numbers to back up that strategy. Overall, though, I think this is a very good card, and I would say that it's definitely a B. Mind Grind is basically the same thing as Mind Funeral, but the problem is that you have to pay X instead of a colorless for the same effect. Now, the X has to be 4 in order to get that same effect, meaning the total mana cost for this card to equal Mind Grind would be 6. That's just kind of a much lower value, and it's not really a great substitute. Overall, I'd say that this card is a lot cheaper, and if you can't afford Mind Funeral at about $5 per card, Mind Grind might be a good substitute, but overall I'd say it's probably a D. If you don't want to play Mind Funeral or Mind Grind, or you can't afford it, Mind Sculpt might be a better choice. It costs 1 and a blue to put their top 7 cards in your opponent's library. Now, that's pretty good value. It's not as good as Breaking and Entering or Glimpse the Unthinkable, but it's still only $1 per card, approximately. Now, overall, that's going to be about the same effect as a Mind Funeral, so it really is just up to you, depending on what you want to play. Overall, I'd give this one a B. Psychic Spiral costs 4 of anything in a blue to shuffle your graveyard back into your library, and then have your opponent put that many cards from his library into his graveyard. Now, this seems like a really good card, and it's not too bad, but the problem is that it's again 5 mana. Now, this could be a kind of a 1 or a 2 of in your deck and be a kind of a game finisher, but I wouldn't expect it to do too much work. I'd give this card a C. Paranoid Delusions costs a blue and a black to mill 3 cards, but the cool thing is it can cipher on one of your creatures. Now the problem is that you just don't really have that many creatures that can cipher on, so the ability to actually put this onto a creature is very difficult. So overall, unless you're running a ton of creatures, I would say that this is probably a D. Thought Scour is 1 blue to mill 2 and then draw a card. Now it doesn't seem like this card's very good, but it actually really is. Being able to draw a card and get some extra card advantage is huge in this game, so overall I'd say this card is a B. Tome Scour costs 1 blue to have your opponent mill 5 cards. This is half of a Glimpse the Unthinkable, so it's not too bad, but I'd rather fill my 1 slot with Jace's Phantasm or Hedron Crab or other things like that that might be more effective. If you want to play it, again, it's okay. I'd give this one a C. Fans of Lantern Control might consider the mill rocks like Pixis of Pandemonium, Ghoul Caller's Bell, or Codex Shredder. Now, remember, these cards are really, really slow, and without something like an Ensnaring Bridge to hide behind, you're just going to get killed. These cards are just way too slow and should not be included in your mill deck. Similarly, cards like Inquisition of Kozilek, Duress, and Thoughtseize might seem good because they allow you to get some hand disruption in, but at most I'd say they're sideboard cards. They just don't do enough to advance your game of milling out your opponent, so I'd say these are maybe a 1 or 2 of, and then maybe just in the sideboard. Sands of Delirium is a 3-mana artifact with X tap. Target player puts the top X cards of his or her library into her graveyard. Now, this is actually a good way of actually using up extra mana at the end of every turn, but the problem is you usually don't have any extra mana at the end of the turn. Remember, this is a race, and you're going to be casting spells as quickly as you can, so you usually aren't left with a whole ton of extra mana just laying around. So I'd say this is probably just a C. Mesmeric Orb, however, is a 2-mana artifact that says whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that means lands, tokens, anything, that player's owner has to mill 1 card. Remember, this mills you as well, which actually helps to get your Manic Scribe online, and keep in mind that although you might not like milling yourself, it does actually mill your opponent really fast, and you're probably going to mill your opponent out way faster than you can mill yourself out. I would strongly recommend this card, and I'd give this an A. Well, that's it for my mill card review. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe if you do like the video. And if you do have other cards you want to see or other things you want to see, leave a comment in the comment section. Stay tuned for an upcoming mill deck tech where I'll show you the mill deck that I run, and I'll also pair that with some other gameplay videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.